He drives an electric vehicle when he's traveling around the UK. He asks for electric vehicles when he's abroad. His own Aston Martin was converted to run on wine and cheese.
What?
Yes, so as to reduce its environmental impact. Okay. So this is him trying to bring these environmental concerns directly into his own life.
King Charles, from what we've seen this week anyway, clearly he has things he has to do, but he seems to have a similar work ethic. Is that true?
Yeah, King Charles, in the time that I was working with him, was averaging between 500 and 600 engagements a year. What that means on a typical day is probably you're going to visit 2 or 3 events in the morning and likewise in the afternoon, followed by probably an evening reception. Given he is not in the first flush of youth, it was certainly a pretty punchy pace, one that people half his age, myself included, would struggle to keep up with sometimes. But I think they very much follow the example of those that have come before. And in the King's case, as you say, his mother and of course his father had a prodigious work rate. And they see that as exactly the kind of pace that they will be needing to follow as they move forwards. What's good about it is they're extremely interested in people. So each of those events, they are fascinated by the people that they're meeting, and that sort of propels them through it in a way that others might find more difficult.
We've seen that again. We've seen lots of footage of the King. This week going to the different nations of the United Kingdom and engaging in, what people would say is small talk, but it's very important to get that tone right and to also sound genuinely interested in other people. Does he have particular interests and particular types of people that he likes to speak to?
Yeah, I think he, as we all know, is someone that's been passionate about the environment, about social equality, community integration. These are things that have really driven him in his philanthropic work over so many years. But he loves people. He loves talking to people. And what was great to see actually was when he came to Buckingham Palace that first day, he got out of the car because he wanted to talk to people before politicians. And I think that's very indicative of what we'll see moving forwards. It's fascinating to him to hear what's on people's minds, and he spends a great deal of time sort of distilling all of that information down. If you are talking to hundreds of people every week, naturally you're probably getting an incredibly good sense of public mood, things that people care about, things that they're worried about, almost more than perhaps a politician who may be more pegged to one place. They are covering so much ground. Most counties of the year, certainly all of the nations of the year, they will see people in all of those places, and the range of discussions they have is extremely useful.
Now, years ago, before you worked with the now King, he was perceived, I think it's fair to say, as someone who perhaps was not completely in touch with his emotions around the time of his marriage to Diana. And in fact, at the engagement, you'll remember that, "Are you two in love?" Well, of course we are, whatever in love means. And people, do still remember that. Now, fast forward, many decades, and we do see touches of emotion, whatever that might be. We see him with a grief-stricken face for his mother. We see him getting annoyed at a pen or a collection of pens on a too small table. How emotional or how in touch with his emotions would you say he is?
I think that it was one of the things that I was both surprised by and alerted to when I came into the royal household is people said, you'll be surprised that the version or the vision that you think you know about him won't stack up to the reality. And it was absolutely true. His EQ, I think we call it these days, his ability to sort of connect and understand people's feelings is extremely high. He can sense when people are having a hard time. He's very good at relating to people who suffered bereavement. Obviously, often in very tragic circumstances, he will meet people that have suffered and he can connect with them. The flip side of that, actually, again, is he's, and you'd expect me to say it, but actually I'm confident that people will see this. He's a very charismatic individual. So yes, I think for years people laboured under this impression that he was very serious, very po-faced. But you have to remember, a lot of the time when you saw him, he was standing up, giving a speech of remembrance, laying a wreath. He was doing sort of serious things. Actually, what we'll see now is probably a bit more range, and that will allow some of his natural characteristics to come through.
Is it true that he does not eat lunch?
It is, I regret to say, true that he doesn't eat lunch. It's one of the things that you are warned about early on in your royal career, and you forget naturally, as I did. And then as you reach about 4:00 and your stomach is rumbling during some very important speech and you're feeling a bit lightheaded, you tend to not forget again. So the trick that we advise people, two things: always have a big breakfast and bring some sort of nut bars or something with you. Second thing is, never miss a convoy, because once they get in a car and that car starts moving, they will stop for nobody. And I've had many an extremely senior journalist who has been looking around and enjoying the environment they find themselves in, left behind in some quite remote places around the world because they didn't follow the rules.
Why doesn't he eat lunch? Is he very kind of aware of his health?
I think it's a little bit of that, but there's also just a sort of boringly practical point. If you are standing up and you're talking to people whilst trying to cram a sort of small sandwich in your mouth at the same time, not only is it quite hard to speak to people, but it makes for some pretty unedifying pictures as people sort of get you mid-chew. So I think there's a little bit of that. It's just impractical. So he sort of disciplined himself to have breakfast, and then the next stop tends to be at 5:00 when there'll be sandwiches, a piece of cake, and that's really the moment when he and the Queen Consort get together, talk about what's happened that day, decompress a little bit. So once you get in the rhythm of it, it enables him to be very efficient throughout the day, and it starts to make sense.
Now, growing up in the 80s, as I did, Prince Charles, as he was then, people knew what his interests were, and he was lampooned on, for example, Spitting Image for talking to plants and caring about this weird thing called the ozone layer or the environment. Clearly he's very much associated with environmental issues. What's he going to do now that he is king in terms of his support for those kinds of causes?
I think you're absolutely right. From a very early stage in his life, he would say, I was seeing things happening and people were telling me what was happening around the world, and I felt I had to speak out about it. That passion has stayed with him. I mean, he gave his first speech on the environment in 1971, in which he said, I can see there is a huge amount of single-use plastic coming into our world. This is going to cause a problem because it won't go anywhere, and it will cause a problem for us further down the line. That was more than 50 years ago now. He then went on to give his first speech about youth opportunity in the House of Lords in the mid-70s, and essentially was saying it can't be right that just because you come from a difficult background, you have no chance to get out and fulfill your potential. And that was really the germ of the idea that led to the Prince's Trust, which is now more than 40 years old and has helped more than 1 million people into employment. As he has changed role now, naturally there have been people that said, well, how are you going to stop being this outspoken campaigner? And he's always been really clear about it. He understands the difference between being a campaigning prince and a convening monarch. I spoke to him several times about it over the years, and he would give the example for perhaps of a barrister. You can spend years advocating a strong point of view in the case of a barrister on behalf of your client, but have a very, very strong and outspoken view. Then you can become a judge when you sit back and you are more impassive. You will hear both sides of an argument, but you won't necessarily land on one side or the other. Now, his view was, if a barrister can become a judge, so why not a prince becomes a king and moves and accepts the new constitutional parameters within which this new role will work. And he talks about this in a documentary for his 70th birthday in 2018. And he said, I know the difference. I'm not that stupid, it was the phrase he used.
Do you think as king he will take fewer flights because of his concerns and the concerns we all have now about the environment?
It's one of those topics which I thoroughly enjoyed discussing with editors who would say, well, he claims to be this environmentalist and there he is off on private jets. And I think that the easiest thing I would say is what he said to me is the day that they invent an electric plane, I will be the first person on it. In the meantime, you have to weigh up your responsibilities as head of state. Don't forget, a lot of the time when he's traveling, he is going at the request of the government. And it's one of those other foibles where the media will say he is trotting off around the world. He is being asked to go to these countries to represent the UK abroad. Then there is the most efficient means of transport, which is a mixture of time, security, and all the other concerns that go into it. But at his heart, you've seen he drives an electric vehicle when he's traveling around the UK. He asks for electric vehicles when he's abroad. His own Aston Martin was converted to run on wine and cheese.
What?
Yes, so as to reduce its environmental impact. Okay. So this is him trying to bring these environmental concerns directly into his own life.
What do you think the new monarchy, the new reign that we are approaching now, how will it differ to the Elizabethan age that we are coming out of now? In what way will he modernise things?
I think that one of the things about monarchy is that it is continuous. So when one king or queen breathes their last, so the next king or queen is immediately installed. It is a seamless transition stretching back 1,000 years, and people will have their own views about that. Whilst I think, therefore, one of the things that he will be very focused on is continuity and reassurance, because that is one of the roles of monarchy, is to be a figure of, be visible, be reassuring, to reflect the mood of the nation back. Part of reflecting that will be to take stock and say, well, where are we as a nation now? How does the monarchy reflect that? And he has talked in the past about a slimmed down monarchy, less working members of the family. Despite the fact that he stands on a palace balcony, actually this is somebody who is incredibly focused on value for money. He hates waste. If you look at the clothes he wears, these are suits that have been kept going since the sort of mid-90s. The morning suit that he wears to Ascot was made for him in 1984. He's got shoes that were made from leather that were dredged up from the seabed and was more than 200 years old. So he is a fan of making do and mending. On the wider scale, of course, this is really, really hugely difficult economic times that we're in, and he will be really acutely aware of not wanting to look like he is tone deaf to the challenges that the public is facing. Now, I say again, there is royal life, and that will always look incredibly privileged and luxurious compared to the struggles that many, many other people are having. But it is in his mind, and I'm sure that will be driving him and the way he wants to run things moving forward. Okay.
Just finally on King Charles and on the subject of modernisation, one small thing that I noticed this week and a lot of the papers picked up on was the kind of blurring of the edges of protocol. In other words, a couple of the royal couples holding hands after the Queen's coffin was brought into Westminster Hall. That kind of softening of the edges of protocol, do you think that's something, generally speaking, that Charles will be comfortable with?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I saw a bit of that. The thing to understand about protocol, and there may be people watching, listening who will disagree, protocol is a set of rules, but it's also a set of traditions and precedents where you look to see how things have been done before. I don't think there's ever been in the protocol rule book a thing that says you cannot hold hands. I think that there's such huge media scrutiny on everything that's happening at the moment that people will interpret every single move and apply value to it. Common sense is huge. Common sense and precedent is usually what is applied in the household when you're trying to think about how best to do things. Things have naturally, gradually, in some ways relaxed over time. I'm sure the way that, I know the way that, for example, you are required to dress in the palaces is entirely different from 1952 to 2022, particularly for women. I am sure that these things will continue to adjust, to evolve. The thing about monarchy is many people sort of say it's this great big monolith with men in sort of, grey suits who are not in touch with the times. But actually, I think it moves very imperceptibly, but it does keep moving forwards. The Queen had a Twitter feed, an Instagram feed, a website. She sent tweets. She was doing Zoom meetings, Teams calls, just like the rest of us.
Yes.
So, in some of those practical ways, you see that it is keeping pace, and I think that will continue.
Now, let me ask you about Camilla. I think it's fair to say that she has been on something of a journey. There were years ago when she was perceived in a very different way. Obviously, then she married Prince Charles as he was then, and things have changed. How would you assess the journey that she has been on?
I think that the Queen Consort, obviously, hers is a story in three parts. I feel, there was this young romance that happened between her and the then prince. Then, obviously, you have this very difficult phase of their lives where marriages were breaking down and they were coming back together. Then what you have, and I think the most useful thing to look at now, is the last 17 years, the time that they've been married. And when the Queen said in her statement for the Platinum Jubilee that it was her sincere wish that she would take on the role of Queen Consort, there was obviously a lot of media speculation around that time of why has she decided that. And the easiest thing to do actually was just to say, well, look at the work that she's done over the last 17 years. So she's someone that now has more than 100 patronages, charities, military affiliations. She's doing herself, partnering with the now king with those hundreds of engagements every year. But she's tackling issues which are not always the most glamorous things. So she champions domestic violence, loneliness, isolation in old age, things like that, which are not always the most glittering of causes to get behind. The other thing that I think is really interesting is she has these strong military affiliations, some of which were given to her explicitly by the Duke of Edinburgh. Now, I think we all know that if the Duke of Edinburgh had not held her in high regard, he would not have been bestowing his royal colonelcies onto her. So it was, for me at least, I would say to people, look at the body of work that she's done over the last 17 years. And from that, you should be able to see what her attitude is to being a member of the royal family, which is, in many senses, she understands the institution. She understands what duty and service means. And I think gradually we're seeing people come around to, again, a bit like the king, they're looking at her afresh, looking at what she's been doing for the last number of years and beginning to make up their minds again about her. Yes.
I thought what was really interesting and quite telling, not in a bad way, it was revealing, I suppose, was the clip of the king getting a bit annoyed about a leaky pen, which I think we can all relate to because it's the small things that irritate us. And also, this is a man who's just lost his mother, who's not had much sleep, who's had to do so many things and cover so many miles over the last week or so. But she was just kind of there, just like making things better and absorbing some of that pressure. Is that what she does?
I think you put it really well. I think theirs is a real partnership. People have often said she brings out the best in him. My view is I think they bring out the best in each other. The Queen Consort is someone, don't forget, who lived in the real world, you might say, for the first 50 plus years of her life. Now, yes, it was a life of privilege, but she was not in the royal bubble for that time. She subsequently marries into it in 2005. So now what you have is someone that is almost uniquely placed to have a perspective of the real world, as we might call it, and the royal world. And she is a very good bridge between the two. So she can help the king, provide him with context, give him reassurance that some things are fine to do, maybe some things wouldn't land so well. And in those moments of stress, I have no doubt that, like any great partner, they will say afterwards, look, don't worry about it. It's not the end of the world. She'll understand exactly as you say, having lost his mother on Thursday, having barely had his feet touch the ground in the time since, there are occasions when a small thing happens through which you will channel your frustration. And I think we all do that. I think she will be a steadying hand on the tiller after a moment like that, just to say, do not worry, keep going, it's all fine.
Yeah. What can you tell me about Camilla that I don't already know? Apparently she loves Strictly. What else can you tell me about her?
What can I tell you? She loves Strictly. She once arranged an engagement at Buckingham Palace with one of her age concern charities for a tea dance in order to bring the Strictly dancers to Buckingham Palace, which I thought was a rather brilliant combination of work and her own private passions. She loves the Archers. She is an avid reader and launched her Instagram book club just a couple of years ago.
What kind of stuff does she like to read?
She has got an incredible range, actually, and she, much like a number of other people, she releases recommended reading lists.
Oh.
So I would urge you to follow the Duchess of Cornwall Reading Room. If you get a chance, it'll probably be renamed now.
Yes.
But the other thing that people may not know is, much like the King, she's an avid gardener, and when she does have those moments to be at home, you're as likely to find that she's out in the garden or out walking her dogs as she is inside. That was usually the case when I was speaking to her. Actually, the other thing as well is she has a huge interest in the media. If I was a betting man, I would say in another world, she would have loved to have been a journalist. She follows the media, radio, television, journalism, print journalism in particular, and is fascinated by the mechanic of it. And actually, it shows when she is out at engagements, particularly when you're traveling around the world. She knows the journalists. She knows they're called the Royal Rota, the people that follow the royal family around the world. She knows them by name. She asks about their family, and actually the media, the journalists will tell you for that reason they all think very highly of her.
Just finally, I want to ask about how things will change in terms of the royal household. Now, clearly people have known for decades that things are going to change should the Queen die and Charles become king. We've heard about the redundancies for some people within Clarence House. With the new regime and the new, Buckingham Palace and Balmoral and all the rest of it, what do you expect to see change? How will things have to be changed?
I think there's a huge job, and I don't mean this in a sort of trite way, but this in some ways it's a merger between Clarence House and Buckingham Palace, and naturally it's extremely sad to see what's happening with my former colleagues at Clarence House. My understanding is that there is a sort of legal obligation to inform people of this change in their work situation as quickly as possible, and that's why that's happened this week. I think that going back to what you were talking about before about modernising the monarchy, I think that what will happen is these two households will come together. The king and his private secretary and the master of the household will then start to look at the workforce. They'll look at the work that the king had been doing previously as Prince of Wales. He's already talked about not being able to do so much of that. They'll look ahead at the prodigious amount of work he needs to do as head of state. We haven't had a travelling head of state abroad for a number of years. And I think they will start to adjust the focus of the work and the workforce that comes in behind that as a result. Now, I don't think that's going to happen immediately. I think it's probably going to take a year or so before you see really any big changes. And I think it'll be 5 years before you see the true shape of this next reign.
Well, that's really interesting. Can you pick a few words then that you think sum up what you think the reign of King Charles III is going to be like from the 6 years that you worked so closely with him?
I would say duty and service. That is the thing that runs through him in everything he does. And I think grandfather of the nation. I think that's what we will see. This is somebody, for me, who is Prince. That is a title that sort of conveys a sense of youth and, what have you. I think now that you see him again, you sort of appraise him again as king. Grey hair, deep voice. I think he fits the bill. And I think that we're going to see somebody who will grow into that role. And I hope that the public will grow into it with him.